Hi everybody, this is the Friendly Authoritarianism PowerPoint. The entire point of this chapter in Sugimoto's book is really to explain that Japanese society has different ways to standardize and control behavior as well as thought patterns, attitudes, and he has really dubbed this type of control friendly authoritarianism. The authoritarian part comes from the observation that these means of control are imposed from those in power and that this control is presented as natural and that it should just be accepted by those who are being influenced or controlled. Now, the friendly part comes from the way that control is implemented in a benevolent or friendly way so that those being influenced don't really see it necessarily as coercive. In the first part of his chapter, he outlines 4 general methods that those in power use to exert control or influence. First of all, you have mutual surveillance within small groups, and these groups exert a lateral or what we call a horizontal control over each other in a way that ensures compliance within and between groups. Moreover, power is made visible and tangible in a number of ways. First of all, to ensure that people are always aware that society is keeping tabs, but also to remind people of what is considered proper behavior. The third part is that those in power deliberately make laws or description of job duties ambiguous so they can manipulate people in situations the way they want without technically violating any clear-cut rules. Basically, this ensures that those in power always have the means to exert whatever power they deem necessary. And then the last one is using moralistic ideology to influence the way people think and act. Moralistic ideology basically means to instill ideas about what is right and wrong in terms of thought and behavior. For example, you would find in this category songs with moral messages or manner posters. He also outlines 4 ways that these methods of control or influence are kept friendly. For example, those in power use positive incentives like carrots over sticks, as well as those in power really are portrayed as benevolent and caring so as to inspire loyalty from people. They also propagate the ideas of equality and homogeneity to encourage people to conform and work hard to achieve goals. And lastly, fun or pleasant activities are used to socialize people into thinking or behaving a certain way and to conform to the group. So this would include things like singing songs with moral messages. School festivals encourage school spirit, group work, and loyalty. The first method that Sugimoto mentions is that those in power use mutual surveillance to exert control over people, and that this mutual surveillance is achieved by using the Han system. And we've already talked about the Han system, but basically the translation of the word Han means group. So the Han system is when a larger group is broken up into smaller groups of 5 to 10 people, and these groups then compete against each other in achieving some type of goal or a set of goals for some type of reward. Usually those rewards are intangible, meaning they get some sort of pride or respect or acknowledgement for having achieved that goal. Now, these pictures show Han groups in school. They're usually arranged in desk groups, but here you see them serving lunch, for example. And the groups are literally labeled Han number 1, Han number 2. In Japanese, it's Ippan, Nihan, Sampan, for example. Where can you see the Han system in practice? Basically, you can see this pretty much everywhere in Japan, but mostly in schools, clubs, work, government, neighborhood associations. Entire countries sometimes is divided into prefectures, and then prefectures are divided into cities. So this is a type of Han. Now the picture on the right is from Japan's Healthy Aging Networks, which has the acronym Han. And the poster basically tells you how to stay healthy. For example, what to do and what not to do. So no smoking and limit alcohol consumption. as well as, for example, what to do, exercise, diet, sleep, lower your stress. But also, if you notice here, I'm not sure if you can see this, the first one listed is keeping an orderly lifestyle, meaning to keep a schedule and clean your space. And then the picture at the bottom shows a neighborhood Han cleaning the park. So this is an example of what a neighborhood association would do, or a Han in a neighborhood association. So how exactly do Han groups encourage people to follow the rules? Well, first of all, let's sort of break this down from the very beginning. The goals set out for the Han groups represent norms of behavior or attitude that are valued by whoever's in power. So for example, if it's a teacher, they might value keeping the classroom clean or turning in homework assignments on time. The Hans are basically set up to compete with each other. So it's an intergroup competition to achieve that particular goal, whether it's cleanliness or academic achievement. And the Hans are compelled to achieve these goals for some type of reward, which we've already sort of discussed. But for example, the Han that cleans the best gets their name at the top of the class competition chart, recognition as the best, as it were. And you need everyone in the group to comply to achieve these goals. That's called intra-group compliance. Pardon me. And those groups who meet the goal are rewarded with usually recognition as the best. But because groups are collectively rewarded, individuals and groups who did less than their best are looked down upon as pulling the rest of the group down. So that's how a Han system encourages people to conform. So considering how collective responsibility works in these groups, one of the questions I had was, do you see why ijime, which means teasing or bullying, might be a problem in Japan? So basically what happens in this situation is that students may all get punished if one person acts out, whether it's a Han or the class in general. For example, I think Sugimoto gave this one. A baseball team has to withdraw from national competition because of something that one of their players did. Or for example, if someone in the class acts out, the entire class may have to stay after school. So ijime, or bullying, is one way to achieve that type of conformity. Another way, which is not mentioned in Sugimoto's article, is murahachibu. Murahachibu means shunning or public ostracism. So this originally meant being excluded from 8 out of 10 aspects of village life. Basically, in this case, in the school, students ignore the person who isn't performing as expected. They act, in a lot of cases, as if that person doesn't exist. This is an example of murahachibu. This is kind of interesting, but in 1996, there was a huge outbreak of E. coli from school lunches, and thousands of students in Japan became sick. And because it was hailed as a contagious disease, students who hadn't gotten sick were shunning those who did get sick. So an example of murahachibu, as well as a lot of bullying, like calling students who got sick, they call them 0157 in Japanese, and that is the strain of E. coli that caused the outbreak. But this one here, what's written on the screen, says, this closeness has deep roots in Japanese society. In traditional agrarian Japan, so they're talking about murahachibu here, families group tightly as a hamlet or a village to manage rice production and irrigation. The village often held religious rites, swapping aid and labor among members, and was so strict and interdependent that if someone was caught chopping down communal firewood, his whole family would be barred from village life in a severe practice known even today as murahachibu, or village ostracism. So moving on to the types of activities that Han groups do in school, this is a chart of the Hans here. So you have Han number 1, Han number 2, Han number 3, and their responsibilities. So what we see here, for example, is wiping the floor, cleaning here, sweeping, that sort of thing, cleaning the blackboards. But that also, Han groups can do things like class projects, where each Han group is responsible for a specific part of the class project. There's sports and cultural day, again, broken up into different responsibilities for the different Han groups. They compete for test scores or completed homework. Also, lunch duties is really important in Japanese school as well. Lunch duties are performed by Han groups. And of course, you have, for example, cleaning. And the examples right there. How does the TQC, which means Total Quality Control movement in Japan, work? What kinds of workers does it create? Essentially, TQC, or I guess what is also known as total quality management, is very different in Japan as compared to the United States, for example, or Canada. Japanese don't just make random checks on products at the end of production. Rather, each person in the manufacturing is responsible for quality control at all times in the process. So basically, TQM is often called voluntary control. And in Japanese, this is jishu kanri. And this exemplifies the sense of what Sugimoto is describing in terms of friendly authoritarianism. But basically, Hans are made up of small groups of workers in a particular division. And then each group is encouraged not only to maintain perfect quality control, but also, so I think I switched slides without meaning to, but also to make proposals to improve the process. And this basically creates joint responsibility and workers who are dedicated to the company. So this is really great for the company, but it also puts pressure on people to come up with proposals and may contribute to overwork and stress. And I was going to show you a video, but I've lost my link here. So I'm going to have to maybe put this at the end of the slideshow when I post this. But basically, total quality control or total quality management, whatever you want to call it, and Kaizen go hand in hand. Now, Kaizen isn't a word we've heard before, but is essentially the Japanese business philosophy of continuous improvement of working practices and personal efficiency. So how this works is Han groups or individuals are given the goal of proposing things to improve production. Notice in the graphic here how that starts with getting employees involved, then gathering a list of problems, and then encouraging solutions, and then testing the solution, or picking an idea and then testing the solution, and so on. Again, there is supposed to be a video here, but I figured you probably wouldn't be able to access it this way, so I decided to leave it out. You can take a look at it later. Sugimoto talks quite a bit in this chapter about Japan's neighborhood associations as small grassroots Han groups. Now, most Japanese families belong to a neighborhood association group. It is considered essentially semi-mandatory to participate in these. It's often conspicuous if you decide not to participate. But the unit of membership is the family. So the head of the family, who's usually the father, the male, attends the meetings and makes the decisions. And these neighborhood associations serve as a grassroots kind of governance. Basically what they do is they cooperate with local government and semi-government agencies by introducing and putting pressure on members to comply with laws and social programs. So here again, we see that there is horizontal or lateral pressure versus vertical pressure. But basically, neighborhood association activities would be fairly simple, like cleaning gutters, gathering donations, but they would also do things like distribute government flyers, transmit government programs like sanitation programs. They do crime prevention, fire, they practice for disaster drills. They also do fun things like local galas and festivals. They clean parks, and they participate in making their neighborhood meet sanitary requirements. Now, looking back a little bit, actually, no, that's the next slide, sorry. The main purpose of neighborhood associations is to maintain a sense of social bonding between neighbors. And this is what we call fostering social capital. And Putnam defines social capital as upholding or creating norms of reciprocity and mutual trust through face-to-face social networking, which fosters successful cooperation and collective action. And some neighborhood associations expect members to donate for money. For example, if someone dies or gives birth or gets hospitalized. And there are also subunits of neighborhood associations that exist at the team, that's the Han, the group, gumi, and block, buroku levels. So usually small groups of individuals. So there are sort of different levels of Han groups. And those individuals who do less than their best are looked down upon, again, as pulling the rest of the group down. And like I said, most families belong to the neighborhood association. So this is a really important part of Japanese life. Part of the job of neighborhood associations is to fundraise, and how they fundraise is based on a sort of Han system. For example, they use a system called the vertical quota allotment. So what happens is a semi-governmental national community chest organization sets a quota for each prefecture based on population. And each city and then neighborhood association branch is given a monetary goal based on their population or number of members. Then they're asked to meet that goal. And because it's embarrassing not to reach the goal, members try to save face by getting others to comply. But these neighborhood associations they weren't always so, I would say, sort of benign. In the Tokugawa era, as well as in World War II, they served as quasi-espionage organizations. So essentially what they were responsible for was they were spies, essentially watching their neighbors for deviant activities and reporting this to the authorities. They also promoted World War II activities at a grassroots level. For example, they were in charge of bombing and fire drills. They were the ones that doled out rations. As you can see here, they're doling out rice rations. They also passed out propaganda leaflets. Now these Gonin Gumi and Tonari Gumi were outlawed after World War II by the US occupation because they played a large role in helping the government. But they made their way back as neighborhood associations that still exist today, which are much more benign than their predecessors. A couple of the things that we also look at is, and what Sugimoto talks about, is how the face of authority or power is made immediately visible and tangible in Japan. And this is what we call, usually this is considered soft control. For example, in terms of law enforcement, how this face of authority is made immediately visible and tangible is through how households are organized into households for crime prevention, which work directly with the police. And of course, we all know about the kobans, the police boxes in every neighborhood. And the kobans, the police, are supposed to use liaison cards to keep track of information on all families in the area. And the kobans are evaluated based on the level of voluntary cooperation. That is, how many of the families turn in these liaison cards so they can keep track of whoever is in the area. And households feel like they have to comply with this. In terms of implementing control in the area of education, teachers display moral authority to their students, so they're constantly sort of serving as a representative of what is moral. There are also mandatory home visits to encourage parents to follow school rules even while they're at home. So rules that are meant to be in the school or portrayed in the school or followed are also supposed to be followed at home. And in some cases, you have direct policing when teachers patrol areas where their students hang out. They're making sure students are acting appropriately even when they're out of school, because what they do out of school reflects on the school itself. And then, of course, in terms of community life, you have Train announcements telling people to be careful and act in a certain way. Manner posters. These pictures show manner poster campaign on JR trains. This one is about perhaps recently having seen women try to apply makeup on the trains. They say, please do it at home. And here you have a guy sort of spread out, obviously taking up all this space. Please do it at home, but share the seat with others. Just reminding people to be respectful. And of course, there are other signs directing proper behavior in other parts of Japan as well. But how has ambiguity been used by those in power? So this is one of those faces of authority Sugimoto talks about. When you're talking about the use of ambiguity, this is the double codes of omote and ura. Remember that omote and ura essentially mean front and behind. This is a visible activity on the surface, that's omote, and ura is the hidden activity going on under the table, so to speak. And ambiguity, when we talk about ambiguity, we mean by keeping laws and job descriptions, for example, shallow and ambiguous, people in power are allowed to interpret and reinterpret the rules to their benefit. So for example, if you think of police procedures, the example of detaining individuals who are arrested in jail so they can interrogate them without a lawyer, these sort of descriptions are kept deliberately vague so police can keep people longer than normal, detain people longer than normal. Also then, if you think of the armed forces, the Constitution states Japan cannot have armed forces that they maintain, yet they have self-defense forces which have served overseas. And in the workforce, for example, ambiguity like not defining your employee job descriptions so that you can have them work longer hours and do things outside of ordinary job responsibilities. Then there's the case of expense accounts, where if you sort of are vague about what can and cannot be included, this leads to rampant misuse of funds and people can use them any way they want. Also in terms of administrative guidance, for example, the public sector is often allowed to manipulate the private sector because of unclear power boundaries. A good example of this is how the Ministry of Education controls textbook content. For example, different textbooks are written, they're submitted for approval, but the Ministry of Education gets to decide which book is chosen. And this particular word is kind of interesting. It's nashikuzushi. Originally, it means payment by installments, but it is basically a euphemism. And what it means is the gradual whittling down of something, creating little precedents so that the next step seems entirely normal. Basically, it's used so that people in power don't notice the changes until it has really fully changed. An example of this is Article 9 in the Constitution states that Japan can have no armed forces. This was, of course, created after World War II. But little by little, Japan changed this. For example, in 1950, merely 5 years after World War II, they created the police reserve forces. And then this sort of got turned into guard services. And then that sort of got renamed into the self-defense forces. And these self-defense forces were sent in larger military units abroad, more and more. And now it is quite accepted that Japan can send large military units to places in conflict, for example, like Iran. Here we get into apology letters. And what purpose do they serve? Of course, with apology letters, the sense of this is that Japanese want to enforce collective shame or responsibility and mind correctness, and to maintain psychological control. So they have people who make mistakes write apology letters. I have an apology letter story, which is quite interesting. I've had to write one apology letter. I was in Japan studying as a foreign exchange student, and I had to leave the country in order to get my visa reinstated because it had run out. In any case, I went to Korea. I traveled to Kyushu and took a boat over to Busan, Korea, where there was a consulate, and I could go there. Of course, it was a Japanese consulate I had to deal with. And I got there, and I had bought a ticket so that it was leaving the same day that I got there, because I thought, well, I'll go in the morning and it will be done by the afternoon. Well, as it turns out, they needed 24 hours to process it. And I had already bought the ticket, didn't have a lot of money. And I told them, well, I have a ticket going back to Kyushu this evening. Can it be expedited at all? And the lady told me that she would talk to her supervisor, and came back and said, if I wrote an apology letter about the fact that I did not know this 24-hour rule, that I could get it that day. In any case, what happened was I had only been studying Japanese for about a year, and I wrote this apology letter as best I could. I'm sure it was horrible by their standards. And in fact, I wonder if they still have it in the office, perhaps framed as the weird gaijin apology letter. In any case, that's my apology letter story. So moving on, other ways the Japanese society maintains mind correctness and moral standards are, for example, the first one is really by socializing people into what is called physical correctness. In the school system and the workforce, people are taught how to stand, how to bow, how low to bow, how to talk, and how to properly do physical exercise, and even clean things like clean the floor. This is the way you do it properly. A good example of physical correctness is radio taiso, radio exercises that Japanese do. Usually in the morning, they all get together in a big area and they do radio taiso. And everybody does the same thing at the same time. The other way that they maintain mind correctness is emotive moralizing, which essentially means they have songs with moral messages and displaying correct behavior. And basically, collective singing is one way to promote mind correctness and establish moral standards. Also, then there is a way of evoking a sense of shame, that if one does something wrong, the person will suffer society's disapproval. Then the last one is equalizing, creating a sense of equality, that everyone has the right to all resources, and if they work hard, they can be successful. Which brings in the notion of Seken. Seken is, it means a community of people with whom we share daily life, but basically it means society. But it ranges from the uchi, this is one of the double code words, which means inside, the uchi members, like your family and friends, to soto, or outside members, meaning strangers or other people in society. But basically, Seken is an abstract idea of society, where society basically means people with a collective view of what is right and what is wrong. And this is invoked to remind people that they should adhere to certain norms, lest they shame or embarrass themselves in front of Seken. Okay, so for some examples, because it's a little tricky to understand this, but for example, there is a phrase called Seken no me, which means society's eyes. And for example, here, let's say a married woman returns to her hometown without her husband to visit her parents. A visit of a few days is fine. However, if she stays a week, she might worry the neighbors will wonder if she's had a spat with her husband. Her husband is on a long business trip. She'd like to visit her parents for a week, but she'd prefer to avoid any potential gossip. In this case, the neighborhood is Seken no me, which is society's eyes. Another example, and here, those of you who know a little bit of Japanese, perhaps, Seken no me ga kowai. And you can see here's the eyes on the person. So most families, Seken no me also would include this example. Most families voluntarily fill out the koban liaison cards because they are afraid to cast suspicion on themselves if they don't. Sugimoto also talks about the fantasy of egalitarian competition, and that is really the illusion that everyone who works hard And when we say works hard, this is where the word gambari or gambaru comes in. Anybody who works hard can attain success, but of course that's not always the case. There also is the illusion that one can get into prestigious universities based solely on entrance exam scores. But we've talked about this, and we know, for example, that those who don't have money or the background or the connections are least likely to succeed in any given system. A really good example of this fantasy of egalitarian competition is the Tokyo Medical University admissions scandal. In 2018, essentially, female applicants were denied admissions even though they had the highest scores to Tokyo Medical University. And take a look at what's written here on the slide. At least 9 Japanese medical schools manipulated admissions in part to exclude female students, a government investigation has found. The inquiry was launched in August after the prestigious Tokyo Medical University was found to have tampered with the scores of female applicants from as early as 2006. Reports cited concerns that many women would not go on to practice medicine. Japan's education minister said the scandal was deeply disappointing. I want the universities to make immediate and courteous responses regarding the situation of the applicants. Japanese government has been trying to boost women in the workforce and into senior positions, and the medical school scandal has come as a setback. But of course, the interesting thing was that the people interviewed, when they said, why did they handle the scores like this? Some had said that they felt that the women would just quit once they got married and have children, so their education would be wasted on them, was one of the comments. It was really interesting. If you get a chance, read about the entire thing. Anyway, these are the Tokyo Medical University. I don't know if they're the board members, of course, apologizing to Seken. Lastly, we get to this whole shifting balance that Japan is going through. Modernization has really put a strain on the ability of social institutions like school to maintain conformity. But not only that, the education system has been changing, and consumerism, of course, has created individuals who don't want to conform necessarily. But also then you have minorities, people without access to resources like money or parental connections, as well as subgroups, subculture groups who don't fit into the system. And all these people exert sort of an anti-conformity force in Japan. And of course, those groups are getting larger and larger. So the balance really is between social conformity, where people are forced to conform essentially, and cultural form, which allows for more individuality. So there's those two dichotomies. And then between economic efficiency, where conformity is desired because, of course, it's good for the economy, everybody does what they're told to do, and political or individual equity, where individuality and less conformity would be better. So there's sort of these 4 different components, and they're in juxtaposition with each other. The last one, and I'm sorry I can't show you this video here. So if you watched the clip earlier, this is a parody on Japanese apologizing. And it shows you that if you've, essentially just bumped into somebody, you just kind of make a quick head bow. But if you've done something really terrible, you have to bow quite a bit lower. And we can see here in this picture, this is the lowest bow that you can achieve, and you have to be 1 centimeter away from the floor. And a lot of time in the video, they also show the fact that you should go, your bow should be 45 degrees, then your bow should be 90 degrees or whatever. In any case, the parody really is quite interesting. Of course, there's a sense here that collective responsibility is valued, right? Is first what the parody is showing you. Also interconnectedness, where if you did something that affected someone else, you need to fix that. You need to apologize for it. But also, it is kind of a purification as well in Japanese society. To apologize means that you sort of cleanse yourself of wrongdoing. It's almost as if it's sort of a Catholic sense of going to oh shoots, I forget, confession. Also the notion of Seken, society comes in here, that society will not forgive you if you don't apologize. But mostly what you see in the video is a sense of physical correctness, that depending on the depth of your mistake, you bow a certain number of degrees to indicate more sincerity or regret. We can also point to hierarchy here, that you bow lower to those in higher power. And then again, a video that I didn't show you here, and that was the fact that the dog, somebody's dog had been, trained to actually apologize. But basically that's it for friendly authoritarianism. And if you get a chance to look at those videos, I'll post them on the PowerPoint that I will post in Moodle. All right, have a good day. それじゃあまた。